The applause hit me like a gunshot. It wasn't for me. It was for them. Laura stood in the center of the ballroom, her hand resting on his shoulder on Mark Hansen, our neighbor, our friend, the man who used to borrow my tools and drink my whiskey on Saturday nights. The orchestra played a slow waltz, and they moved together like they'd been practicing for years. Maybe they had. People clapped, feeling confused but polite. They thought it was cute, the wife giving her husband's best friend a dance. But I knew better. I could see it in the way she looked at him. That wasn't a dance. It was a confession. My name's Thomas Reed. I'm 55 years old, a retired architect, and up until that moment, I thought I'd built a solid life, steady, symmetrical, safe. Turns out, I'd spent 30 years designing a house made of glass, and tonight, she threw the first stone. The night had started soft like every American dream does. Our daughter Emily had planned everything down to the last candle, a cozy anniversary dinner at a lakeside hotel in Vermont. White roses, string lights, old friends Sinatra playing on vinyl. She wanted to surprise us. And she did. Laura looked stunning, hair pinned up a silver dress, catching every shimmer of the chandeliers. People kept saying how lucky I was. I nodded, smiled, raised my glass, pretending to agree. Truth is, I already felt something off in the air, a silence between us that no music could fill. 30 years of marriage should have been enough to know the rhythm of her breathing, the tempo of her moods. But that night, she moved to a beat I'd never heard before. After dinner, Emily took the mic, voice trembling with pride. To Mom and Dad, she said, 30 years of love, laughter, and partnership. You've shown me what forever looks like. Everyone clapped. I took Laura's hand. It felt colder than the champagne in my glass. Then she asked for the microphone. Just one more thing, she said, smiling in that careful, rehearsed way people do when they're about to detonate something. I want to dedicate this dance to the man who's made me feel alive for the last 10 years. The room went still. My chair scraped the floor as I stood. I didn't even think. My body just reacted the way it always had when she spoke. For 30 years I'd risen whenever she did. The guests turned toward me, clapping again, expecting me to take her hand. And then she looked past me, straight at Mark. He stood up awkwardly at first, then confident, smiling, that artist's smile, the kind that always hides a little arrogance under charm. Laura extended her hand. He took it. My world narrowed to that single gesture, two hands meeting in the air, a silent declaration that made every vow I'd ever spoken crumble like ash in my throat. The orchestra began to play. A waltz. God, of course it was a waltz, our song. The one we'd danced to on our wedding night, barefoot in the rain. When the world was small and full of promise, she moved with him, exactly as she used to move with me. The same tilt of her head, the same smile that said, you and I against the world. I felt people watching me. Pity, curiosity. Someone whispered, it's probably a joke. Someone else said, how romantic. Romantic. That word burned worse than betrayal. I didn't say a thing. Didn't shout, didn't storm out. Architects don't collapse in public. We wait for the cracks to show, then take measurements. So I measured everything. The distance between them, 6 feet, shrinking fast. The angle of her head, 45 degrees toward him, not me. The time it took her to smile, immediate. She hadn't smiled at me like that in years. When the song ended, people cheered. Mark bowed theatrically. Laura curtsied, blushing. And me, I clapped too. 3 slow, deliberate claps, the sound of something breaking cleanly in two. Emily looked at me, horrified. Dad, she whispered. I smiled. Beautiful night, isn't it? I walked to the bar, ordered bourbon neat. The bartender hesitated, glancing toward the dance floor, maybe wondering if he should say something. I nodded once. He poured. The whiskey burned going down, but it wasn't enough. Because the real fire was inside. Not anger, not yet. Just clarity. I looked at my wife. My former wife, though she didn't know it yet, laughing with Mark touching his arm like I'd been erased from the photograph of her life. I realized then that I wasn't in love anymore. I was in evidence collection mode. They came over after the dance, smiling, flushed. Mark said something like, "Hell of a night. Huh, Tom?" I looked him dead in the eye and said, "You have no idea." Laura tried to play it off. Said the dance was just symbolic, that I was reading too much into it. I nodded politely. She leaned in, whispering, "Please don't make a scene." I whispered back, "Scenes require actors. I'm done performing." Then I walked away. Outside, the lake shimmered under the hotel lights. Vermont nights have a kind of silence that swallows sound like the world holds its breath. I stood there, staring at our reflections in the water, her silhouette still dancing behind the glass mind, standing motionless in the dark. That's when it hit me, the first clean-cutting thought since the music started. She thinks she humiliated me. She has no idea what I'm capable of when I'm quiet. Inside, laughter swelled again. The party went on. But something inside me had shifted like a beam giving way under too much weight. I wasn't her husband anymore. I was the man who'd just found his purpose. I finished my drink, tossed the empty glass into the lake, and watched it sink, a small, perfect architecture of ruin, disappearing into the dark. That night, I stopped being a husband. I became a witness. The morning after felt too quiet, like the world had pressed mute just for me. The sunlight on the lake looked fake, too still, like a painting hung crooked on a wall. I sat at the kitchen table, the coffee gone cold, staring at the ring mark Laura's mug had left beside mine. 2 perfect circles, hers smaller, newer, mine chipped at the rim. She came down the stairs humming. Yes, humming. As if last night hadn't happened. As if I hadn't watched her dance with another man, while our entire life collapsed in slow motion. "Morning," she said, all brightness. "You slept in?" I nodded. "Yeah, must have been a long night." She poured herself juice, glanced at me, just long enough to confirm I wouldn't start a war before breakfast. Then she went on about how lovely the guests were, how kind Emily had been, how maybe we should take a trip soon, somewhere quiet to reset. Reset. That word hit harder than any slap. Emily came in, still in her pajamas, eyes swollen from crying. "Dad," she said softly, "are you okay?" Laura froze for half a second, the orange juice halfway to her lips. I smiled. "We'll be fine." The lie came out smooth, practiced. The same way I'd lied for years about deadlines, about bills, about being happy. An hour later, I packed a small bag, shirts, a sweater, my sketchbook. Laura didn't ask where I was going. Maybe she already knew. Maybe she didn't care. The cabin was only a few miles from the hotel, a wooden structure I'd built in my 30s, back when dreams had weight and sawdust still clung to my hands. It was where I'd drawn my first real design, the blueprint that got me my career. Back then, Laura used to sit beside me barefoot, on the porch, reading art magazines, and talking about how light moved through spaces like it had a soul. I thought she understood me. I thought we were building the same life. Now stepping inside of that cabin felt like entering a memory that had turned on me. Dust floated in golden beams. The table was still there, the one I carved initials into T+L forever. The wood had cracked through the heart. I opened an old metal box from under the bed, the one where we kept photos and letters. There we were, our wedding, 1995, swirling under the Vermont sun. Laura's veil blowing sideways, my hair still brown, both of us too young to know how fragile happiness really was. Then buried beneath the photographs, I found a folded note. its edges yellowed and soft with time. Laura's handwriting. If you ever lose me, remember, love is just another kind of mirror. I sat there for a long time reading that line over and over. I could almost hear her voice from 20 years ago, quiet, half laughing, always a little sad. It hit me then. She hadn't just cheated. She'd escaped. All these years I'd mistaken silence for contentment. The truth was, she'd been fading piece by piece right in front of me. Maybe I'd been too busy drawing houses to notice the cracks in my own. But pity dies fast when money's involved. Later that afternoon, I got a call from an old colleague, Bryant. He still handled the accounting for the small firm I'd left behind. "Tom," he said carefully, "I wasn't sure if I should mention this, but there have been some big withdrawals from your joint account these past few weeks. Significant ones." My stomach went cold. "How significant?" "Nearly 80 grand. Wire transfers to a business name, Hanson Studio Gallery." "Hanson. Mark." Brian hesitated. "Look, maybe it's some investment you both made. I don't know. But the gallery lease went through 2 weeks ago. Laura's name's on the paperwork. So is his." I hung up without saying thank you. I sat there in the cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of our life, feeling the kind of calm that only comes after a bomb's gone off. The puzzle fit together too easily, too perfectly. She wasn't in love. She was building something with my money, using the marriage as collateral. I pictured them laughing over plans, choosing paint colors, naming the place. Maybe Aurora Gallery, something poetic, to disguise the rot underneath. 10 years of secret rehearsals and last night's dance had just been their opening act. I could have raged, could have smashed every photo, burned the letters, screamed into the empty air. But that's not who I am. Architects know one truth better than anyone. If you want a structure to collapse, you don't strike it from the outside. You find the weak beam inside and pull. I poured another cup of cold coffee, sat by the window, and watched the lake catch the afternoon sun. My reflection looked older, sharper, calmer. If she wanted a stage, I whispered, I'd give her one. I showed up at the new gallery the next morning with coffee and a smile. Laura looked startled at first. Guilt flickered across her face like a shadow crossing a window, but she covered it fast. "Tom," she said, trying too hard to sound casual, "I didn't expect you to come." "Of course you didn't," I said softly, handing her the cup. "You and Mark are building something special. I wanted to help." Mark appeared from the back, sleeves rolled up, smelling of turpentine and victory. "Well, look who it is. The master of design himself," he said, his grin wide enough to show every tooth. "You sure you're up for this? It's not exactly architecture." "Oh, I don't mind," I replied. "I like seeing how art gets made." They both seemed relieved, almost charmed by my calm. That's the thing about guilt. It makes people see kindness where there's only calculation. The gallery was still a skeleton, then bare floors, unpainted walls, metal beams like exposed bones. They'd rented an old boathouse by the harbor, high ceilings, great acoustics. Perfect for what I had in mind. Laura talked about her vision. "I wanted to feel like light is alive, like it breathes with you." Her words came out dreamy, full of passion, the same tone she used to use when talking about us. Mark scribbled notes, pretending to listen, but his eyes were on her hands. It was almost sweet, if it hadn't been so pathetic. They didn't notice the way I measured every wall, every corner, every outlet. Didn't ask why I took photos of the ceiling angles, or why I ordered custom LED fixtures with programmable color cycles. I told them it was for a kinetic light concept, something that would make the space shimmer, change tone, feel alive. They loved it. Of course they did. Artists fall in love with their own reflections. Over the next few weeks, I became indispensable. I picked up materials, designed the lighting layout, adjusted the acoustics. I was the helpful husband again, the man who fixed things, who made life easier. Laura softened. She started talking to me again, about details, memories, even small jokes we hadn't shared in years. She called me Tommy one afternoon, the name she hadn't used since Emily was little. It almost worked on me. Almost. Mark, meanwhile, strutted around like he'd won the war. He'd pat me on the back, say things like, "You've got to admit it's good to see her happy again." I smiled every time. I had to, or he might have noticed the way I gripped the screwdriver, just a little too tight. The real work happened after they left each night. I stayed behind pretending to fine-tune the lighting system. In reality, I was designing the stage. Behind the main wall, I installed a special panel, a double mirror layered with a thin projection film. From the outside, it looked like part of the decor, sleek, minimal, reflective. But when the LEDs shifted to a certain wavelength, the surface would reveal whatever image I programmed into it. I spent hours wiring the lights, calibrating the colors, testing transitions. The gallery would look beautiful, and when the time came, it would speak. A mirror that doesn't just reflect, it remembers. One night around midnight, I stood in the middle of the half-finished gallery. The air smelled like paint and sawdust and deceit. I pressed the remote in my pocket. The lights dimmed. The reflection on the wall changed. And there she was, Laura in our wedding photo, smiling, radiant. Then another image faded in, Laura and Mark, dancing at the anniversary. The two moments overlapped, bride and betrayer, 30 years apart, united in one cruel symmetry. I watched the transition over and over until the faces blurred together. That's when I knew I'd nailed it. The tone, the timing, the truth. They wanted to open their gallery with a show about truth in art. How poetic. They'd get one. When Laura came by the next morning, she ran her hand along the mirrored wall, smiling. "It's perfect," she said. "You really captured what I wanted. Reflection, emotion, vulnerability." I met her eyes in the glass. "You'll see," I told her. "It'll all come alive opening night." She kissed my cheek. For a second, I felt that old warmth, the illusion of being seen, needed, loved. But it wasn't love. It was distraction. And I'd become very good at hiding what lay beneath distractions. As she turned away, I caught our reflections side by side, her radiant, me ghost-like, and it hit me how fitting it was. She wanted mirrors. I was building one she'd never forget. By the end of the month, the gallery gleamed. Every wall white, every fixture humming with hidden circuits. The invitations were sent. The donors confirmed, the press promised coverage. Laura and Mark were ready to debut their masterpiece, and I was ready to debut mine. I stood in the center of that pristine space, surrounded by their art canvases, sculptures, abstractions of emotion, and smiled. They thought I was lighting their dream. They didn't know I was wiring their confession. I wasn't building a gallery. I was building a confession booth. Ellen Cooper had always been the kind of woman who saw through facades, both architectural and emotional. We'd gone to college together, back when she was studying law, and I was sketching floor plans on napkins. We'd kept in touch over the years, sometimes drifting, sometimes orbiting close again. She was one of the few people left who spoke to me without pity. When I called her that evening, my voice must have sounded steadier than I felt. "Ellen," I said, "I need your brain, not your sympathy." She didn't ask why, just told me to meet her at her office after hours. Her firm sat on the top floor of an old brick building downtown, overlooking the courthouse. When I walked in, she was sitting behind her desk, reading, glasses perched low, hair streaked with gray, in deliberate defiance of vanity. She looked up and studied me for a moment. "I saw the pictures from your anniversary," she said quietly. "The internet's merciless these days." "Yeah," I said, sitting down. "So's Betrayal." She leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. Tell me what you want, Tom. I told her everything. The dance, the gallery, the bank transfers. The way Laura looked through me like I was an old photograph she'd already packed away. Ellen listened motionless, except for the occasional tightening of her jaw. When I finished, she exhaled slowly and said, "You don't want to take her to court." "No." "Then what do you want?" I looked at the dark window behind her, where my reflection floated faintly above the city lights. "I want truth," I said. "And the truth deserves an audience." She rubbed her temples. "Tom, you sound like a man rehearsing for a tragedy." "Maybe," I said, "but this time I'm directing it." She sighed, pushed her chair back, and stood. "All right. If you're going to do this, you'll do it with your eyes open. Let me see what they've done on paper." For the next hour, she combed through bank statements, email printouts, and contract copies I'd managed to pull from Laura's desk. She worked in silence, eyes flicking from page to page with clinical precision. Occasionally, she muttered under her breath fragments like unsecured transfer or joint ownership breach. When she finally looked up, her face was a mixture of admiration and disgust. "Well," she said, "they've been busy. Tell me something I don't know." Ellen slid a document across the desk, a notarized lease for the new gallery. "They didn't just rent it, Tom. They used your company's legal entity to open it. The one you retired but never dissolved." I frowned. "That's impossible. I haven't touched those papers in years." "Laura did," Ellen said grimly. "She forged a renewal under your business license. Technically, every cent that went into that gallery came from an account still registered under your name. The utilities, the insurance, the building permits, all of it. Legally, the owner of that gallery is Thomas Reed." I sat back. "You mean?" She nodded. "They built their dream with your name, which means every painting, every wall, every penny that went into it belongs to you." I laughed, once a short, dry sound that barely qualified as human. "Fitting, isn't it? They built their future on the man they buried." Ellen closed the folder. "Tom, listen to me. I know what it feels like to want justice. You remember my divorce, 10 years, 2 lawyers, 3 depositions, and for what? To stand in front of a judge who told me to move on?" "I remember," I said softly. "You came to my office the day after. You said, 'I won the case but lost the person I used to be.'" She nodded slowly. "Exactly. Don't make my mistake. If you humiliate her publicly, you'll destroy yourself too." I smiled, not cruelly, just tired. "I don't want to humiliate her, Ellen. I want the truth to breathe. You can't bury something that deep without poisoning the soil." She studied me for a long moment, then said, "You've already started planning something, haven't you?" "I've started building something," I corrected. We worked late into the night. Ellen helped me structure the evidence, quietly discreet: withdrawals, business filings, Laura's forged signatures. She even tracked down invoices that showed Mark using company funds to purchase art supplies that were really personal luxuries: a new sound system, a weekend retreat in Maine, expensive wine labeled as client gifts. By midnight, we had a folder an inch thick, proof of misappropriation, fraud, and betrayal. If I wanted, Ellen said, I could walk into court tomorrow and freeze every asset under my name. "Do it," she urged. "Shut them down before they open." But I shook my head. "No, not yet. They need the show to happen. They need an audience." Ellen crossed her arms. "You're still thinking like an architect. Everything has to be seen." "Truth has no meaning unless it's witnessed," I said. "Otherwise it's just noise in the dark." For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the ticking of her office clock, the distant hum of cars outside. Finally she said, "You really loved her, didn't you?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stared at the pile of documents between us. Our life reduced to numbers, signatures, and theft disguised as love. Love, I said finally, is the longest con. You invest everything, your time, your trust, your name, and in the end, you don't even get a receipt. Ellen gave a sad half-smile. Then what do you want me to do now? Keep this, I said, pushing the folder toward her. If anything happens, I want you to know exactly what they did, and that I never lifted a finger in anger. Her eyes narrowed. Tom. Relax, I said. No guns, no fire, no police, just light. I'm giving them the thing they crave most: attention. As I left her office, she called after me. Tom, whatever you're building, make sure you can live with it when the lights go out. I turned hand on the door. I've lived with silence for years. I can live with anything. Outside, the night smelled of rain and neon. The streetlights made long pale reflections on the wet pavement, like ghosts of all the choices we'd ever made. I walked slowly back to my car. The folder's contents burned into my find. Laura's forged signature, Mark's smug initials, the lease under my company name. They thought they'd built a monument to passion. They'd built a trap with my fingerprints all over it. I sat behind the wheel and stared at the reflection of the city lights on the windshield, the same soft shimmer I'd engineered into the gallery walls. It hit me then, the symmetry of it all. They built their dream on my mohim. Fitting, I thought, since I'll be the one signing its obituary. The night of the grand opening smelled of champagne perfume and lies. The Hanson Reed Gallery of Modern Reflection, that was the official name on the black and gold invitations, glowed like a jewel on the waterfront. The building had been scrubbed clean, its glass facade catching every shimmer from the lake. Inside, waiters glided between clusters of guests, holding flutes of sparkling wine. Local officials, gallery owners from Boston, and even a small crew from the Vermont Chronicle were there. It was everything Laura had dreamed of. She moved through the crowd in a flowing navy gown, her hair pinned with silver combs, laughing that soft, practiced laugh that once belonged to our kitchen, not a stage. Mark shadowed her, dashing and smug, every inch the artist she'd helped discover. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward, with microphones eager for sound bites about inspiration, creativity, rebirth. I sat in the front row, where she'd asked me to. Her beloved husband, the benefactor. People greeted me with polite smiles, clapping my shoulder, telling me how supportive I was, how much a boy, how admirable. No one saw the irony. They were about to. The ceremony began at 7 sharp. The lights dimmed, and the air filled with murmurs of anticipation. Laura stepped onto the small stage, the microphone glinting in her hand. "Good evening," she said, her voice steady, sweet. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate, not just art, but connection, the reflection between who we are and who we dare to be." Polite applause. She smiled, scanning the crowd, her gaze brushing past me, like a breeze that didn't care to linger. "I especially want to thank my husband, Thomas Reed," she continued, "who believed in art even when he didn't understand it." The audience laughed gently. She meant it as a compliment, a wink, a token gesture to the man who'd funded her resurrection. I smiled back just as softly. Even Ellen, standing in the back of the room, tensed when she heard it. Laura didn't see her. Mark joined her on stage for the final speech. "Art," he said, "is truth made visible." A lovely journey, that line. The universe has a cruel sense of humor. The crowd dispersed into the main hall. Glasses clinked, violins whispered in the corner. Guests admired the installation's sculptures of twisted metal, abstract canvases, light projected across curved surfaces. The gallery was alive and waiting. At exactly 8 o'clock, Mark raised his hand to signal the lighting sequence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "our featured piece, The Mirror of Time," designed by Thomas Reed himself. A spotlight washed over the mirrored wall I'd built. Gasps rippled through the crowd. It's a living reflection, Laura explained proudly. When the light changes, so does the story. She pressed the remote. The lights dimmed. The color shifted from warm amber to a cold electric blue, and the wall began to breathe. At first, people thought it was part of the show. The reflection rippled, and an image appeared, a blurred photograph forming from the darkness. Then it sharpened. Laura. In Rome. Her arms wrapped around Mark's neck, their lips meeting under the orange glow of a street lamp. A murmur spread like static through the room. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else whispered, "Is that?" Laura froze. Her smile faltered, mouth slightly open, as if words had turned to dust before reaching air. Before she could move, the light flickered again. A new image. A screenshot of a bank statement. Withdrawal. $25,000. Joint account. T&L 3D. Below it, another transfer, another date. Then projected in clean white font. Recipient Hanson Studio Gallery. The room was utterly still. Even the violinist stopped playing. And then came the final one, an email. He'll never notice. He trusts me too much. Signed L. It was the silence that made it unbearable, not the images. The silence of 100 witnesses breathing the same stunned air. Laura staggered back. The remote slipped from her hand, clattering on the floor. Her face drained of color. Mark's bravado evaporated instantly. He muttered something. "This isn't me, maybe," then turned and bolted for the door. The photographers followed him like vultures, chasing a fresh scent. Laura turned toward me. For a heartbeat, I almost pitied her. Almost. I stood buttoning my jacket with deliberate calm and walked toward the stage. The lights cast my reflection beside hers on the wall, two figures in perfect symmetry, the builder and the betrayer. I took the microphone. My voice didn't need to rise. The room was listening to every breath. Every wall tells a story, I said. This one just told mine. Flashbulbs exploded. The room shuddered with whispers, and the weight of 30 years pressed down like gravity. Laura stumbled a step forward, shaking. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice breaking on the edge of disbelief and shame. I looked at her, and for the first time in a decade, I truly saw her not as my wife, not as my betrayer, but as a woman, stripped of every mask she'd ever worn. "What have I done?" I repeated softly. Then I looked at the trembling lights dancing on the mirrored wall, at the frozen image of her in Rome, at the words, "He trusts me too much." And I said I only turned on the lights. The cameras flashed again, like lightning catching the truth mid-scream. The explosion didn't stop when the lights went out. It only moved online. By morning, every local paper and half the national tabloids had the same headline: "Infidelity exposed, live artist's grand opening turns into husband's revenge." Clips of the projection flooded social media, the kiss in Rome, the email, the bank statements edited, slowed, shared millions of times. The video became a modern morality play, played over and over by strangers, sipping coffee behind screens. By noon, sponsors pulled their funding. By sunset, the gallery's nameplate had been pried off the door. Mark Hanson's agent dropped him in a single text. Laura's Art Foundation canceled her lectures and exhibitions. The world they'd built on my trust collapsed in 24 hours, quietly, efficiently, beautifully. Ellen called that afternoon. "You saw the news, I lived it," I said. "Well, congratulations. You own a gallery and a scandal. Just what every retiree dreams of." She sighed. "Listen, Tom, you're legally covered. Since the gallery's under your company name, you can claim full ownership. I'll file the paperwork first thing Monday. But you need to stay quiet. No interviews, no statements. Let the noise burn itself out." I promised I would. And for once, I kept my word. 3 days later, Laura came to see me. No reporters followed her. She'd learned that lesson quickly. She showed up at the cabin by the lake just before dusk. I heard her car door slam, then soft footsteps on the wooden porch. When I opened the door, she looked smaller somehow, wrapped in a beige coat that swallowed her shoulders. Her eyes were red, not from makeup or exhaustion, but from something rawer. Shame, maybe. Or survival. "Tom," she whispered, "please, just hear me out." I let her in. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room glowed with that kind of quiet that used to mean safety. "I don't know what to say," she began wringing her hands. "I didn't mean for any of it to happen like that. I got lost." "Lost," I repeated, calm as the still water outside. She nodded, trembling. "You stopped seeing me, Tom. You saw the bills, the blueprints, the mortgage, but not me. Mark." He noticed. He listened. And then it became something else. I thought he cared. But he used me. He used us. Her voice cracked on the last word. I didn't interrupt. I just let the silence stretch the way I'd learned to let cracks weaken before a collapse. Finally, she looked at me through her tears. "I'm sorry. I ruined everything. I know that. I wish you could forgive me." I studied her for a long moment, the woman I'd built half my life around. The woman who'd turned my trust into her raw material. When I spoke, my voice was steady, not cruel, not angry, just true. "You didn't lose me, Laura. You left me." She broke down completely, then quiet, shaking sobs that sounded like confession and defeat all at once. I didn't reach for her. Not out of malice, but because there was nothing left to hold. After a while she straightened, wiped her face and whispered, "What will you do with the gallery?" I looked into the fire, the last coal flickering red. "Haven't decided yet." She nodded, perhaps expecting destruction, fire, a final act of vengeance. But architects don't burn what they've built. They rebuild. Over the following weeks, Ellen handled the legal fallout. Mark vanished. Rumors said he'd moved to Oregon, started painting under a new name. Laura disappeared from social circles, selling off jewelry and hiding from interviews. The press, hungry as ever, moved on to new scandals. The world forgets fast. But I didn't want to. One gray morning, I drove back to the gallery. It stood empty, white walls stripped bare, the mirrored installation still gleaming faintly under dust. I walked through the silence, listening to my own footsteps echo. Every wall still remembered the truth. Every surface still carried a trace of light. I thought about tearing it all down. But then I thought of the people who'd written to me after the story went viral. Strangers, men and women, who said my act gave them something: closure, courage, proof that pain can speak. Maybe that was worth more than revenge. I called Ellen. "I want to keep the gallery," I said. "But not as it was." "What then?" I'm thinking. "Art therapy workshops. For people going through betrayal, divorce, grief. A place where broken stories can hang on walls without shame." She was silent for a while, then said quietly, "That sounds like redemption." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe it's just cleanup." A month later, the sign went up again. The Reflection Center, healing through art. The same walls that once exposed lies now held canvases of recovery. The same mirrors that showed betrayal now reflected courage. Every time I unlocked the door, I could still feel the echoes of that night, the gasps, the flashes, the weight of exposure. But they didn't hurt anymore. They simply reminded me what truth costs. I walked to the center of the room, touched the mirrored wall, and whispered, not to Laura, not to Mark, but to the building itself, if pain built these walls, maybe healing could live inside them. The courthouse smelled like old paper, disinfectant, and irony. 3 months after the opening night catastrophe, Laura Reed, formerly my wife, currently my accuser, filed a civil suit against me. The charges: defamation, emotional distress, and professional sabotage. Translation: she wanted the world to believe I was the villain. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps that morning. The headline had already written itself. Wife sues husband. After public betrayal. Goes viral. I could almost hear the news anchors rehearsing their lines. America loves its scandals neat and symmetrical. One sinner, one saint. One courtroom. Only this time I wasn't playing either role. Her lawyer was young, too young. Maybe 28, all poise and bright ambition. The kind of woman who believed justice could be won with a good haircut and a rehearsed glare. She spoke quickly, passionately, waving her hands as she described my malicious intent, my calculated humiliation. Mr. Reed orchestrated an act of public cruelty, she declared, pacing in front of the judge. He used a place of art funded by love as a weapon of vengeance. My client lost her career, her dignity, and her livelihood. The judge, an older man with tired eyes, nodded slowly, but said nothing. I sat there calm, almost de-aged. I wasn't angry anymore. I'd learned that rage burns fast, but truth has endurance. When my turn came, I stood buttoning my jacket out of habit, the courtroom lights catching the faint gray in my hair. No, Your Honor, I began softly. I didn't destroy her career. I simply turned on a light. The young lawyer rolled her eyes. Poetic, Mr. Reed. But irrelevant. Not quite, I said, sliding a folder onto the desk. Because before the lights came on, she'd already stolen from me. Ellen had prepared the documents, meticulously labeled, stamped, and cross-referenced. The bank transfers from our joint account. The lease agreements signed under my company's name. The forged renewal of my business license. Every line item a breadcrumb, leading straight to her betrayal. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't grandstand. I just laid the papers before the court clerk, like an architect placing blueprints on the table, clean, measured, undeniable. This, I said, is not defamation. It's record-keeping. Laura's lawyer stammered. This isn't relevant to the emotional damages, it's relevant to the truth, I said, which is the only thing I came here for. Laura wouldn't meet my eyes. She sat rigid in her chair, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. For once, she wasn't the actress. She was the witness. Ellen leaned toward me and whispered, "You've already won." But I didn't feel it. Not victory, not triumph. Just the slow settling of justice like dust after a collapse. The judge reviewed the evidence, quietly flipping pages for several long minutes. Finally, he looked up. "Mrs. Reed," he said evenly, "these documents show significant misuse of marital assets and forged business authorization. Given that your claim of defamation does not stand, in fact, I suggest you consider yourself fortunate. Mr. Reed is not filing charges of his own." The gavel struck once, clean, final. Case dismissed. The sound echoed through the room like a nail sealing a coffin. Reporters waited outside, a sea of microphones and flashbulbs. Someone shouted, "Mr. Reed, how does it feel to win?" I paused at the top of the courthouse steps, the fall wind tugging at my coat. "I didn't win a case," I said. "I just stopped being her alibi." The shutters clicked like applause. Somewhere behind me I heard Laura's footsteps, fast, unsteady. "Tom," she called. I turned. She was standing at the bottom of the steps, eyes shining with unshed tears, her lawyer hovering awkwardly a few feet away. "You destroyed me," she said, voice trembling, broken. For a moment, I saw her as she'd been 30 years ago. The woman who laughed barefoot in our first apartment, who painted the walls yellow because she said sunlight could save marriages. I almost believed her again. Almost. Then I remembered the Rome photograph, the forged signature, the email. "He trusts me too much." I shook my head slowly. "No, Laura," I said. "I didn't destroy you. I just stopped protecting your lie." Her face crumpled. She turned away, before the cameras could catch the tears. Ellen touched my arm lightly. "Ready to go home." "Home," I murmured. "Yeah, whatever that means now." We walked past the reporters, their questions fading behind us, the courthouse doors closing like the final act of a play. For the first time in a long time, I felt light. Not happy, just honest. And that was enough. The first page of The Architecture of Truth began with a line I'd carried in my head since that night at the gallery. Every lie needs a wall to lean on until the wall refuses to hold. Writing came easier than I expected. After decades spent designing buildings, I realized stories weren't so different. Both needed foundations strong enough to bear the weight of what people hide inside them. Each morning, I'd rise before sunrise, make coffee, and sit by the window of the cabin overlooking the lake. The pages grew slowly, sometimes painfully, sometimes like confession. I wrote about marriage as a blueprint, how love begins with symmetry, balance, and shared load-bearing walls, until one partner starts removing beams without telling the other. I wrote about betrayal, not as a crime, but as an erosion, invisible, patient, deadly. And I wrote about dignity, that quiet, unglamorous word no one applauds until they've lost everything else. Emily didn't speak to me for weeks after the court case. She thought I had humiliated her mother beyond redemption, that my silence in the press was arrogance. She called once, angry, crying. "You could have stopped it, Dad. You didn't have to expose her like that." I let her vent. I didn't defend myself. Then one afternoon in early winter, she appeared at the cabin unannounced. Her car tires crunched across the frozen gravel. When I opened the door, she stood there, coat half buttoned, eyes red from tears, or the cold, maybe both. She held a book draft in her hands, my manuscript. "Ellen sent me a copy," she said quietly. "She thought I should read it before judging you." I stepped aside to let her in. She sat at the table, flipping through pages covered in pencil marks and coffee stains. "I didn't write it to justify anything," I told her. "It's just what happened from where I stood." She looked up at me, her expression softer now. "I know." We sat in silence for a long while. The fire popped in the hearth. Snow drifted against the window. Finally, she whispered, "You didn't lose a wife, Dad. You found yourself." That was the first time I allowed myself to cry. News about Laura reached me in fragments, whispers carried by acquaintance who didn't know whether to pity her or avoid her. The art community, always eager to forgive its sinners, had turned cold. Sponsors withdrew. Her lectures were canceled. The gallery, now the Reflection Center, was officially transferred under my name after the court ruling. I converted half of it into therapy studios. The other half, once filled with her paintings, remained empty, a deliberate void. I wanted it that way. Mark Hansen didn't fare better. He vanished from the state, leaving unpaid debts and an unfinished exhibit somewhere in Portland. Someone sent me a photo months later, a street mural, signed only MH. A broken mirror painted across a brick wall. How poetic. Sometimes justice writes its own sequel. In the evenings, when the writing blurred into memory, I'd step outside onto the deck and watch the lake freeze. The reflection of the moon scattered across the ice, like glass shards, beautiful, sharp, impossible to touch without bleeding. I thought about Laura often, but not with hate anymore. She'd become a part of the story, not the villain, not the muse, just the lesson. People talk about love as if it's something to keep. But the truth is, love is something that keeps you until it's done teaching. Maybe that's what all this had been, an education in a lost honesty and the slow rebuilding of a man who once mistook silence for peace. One night, as I closed my notebook, the words came to me clear and final, the way a foundation line cuts through soil. Love's not about staying, it's about standing tall when it leaves. I set down my pen, looked out across the dark water, and for the first time in years felt entirely unburdened. No bitterness, no noise, just the architecture of truth, finally standing on its own. 2 years later, the world had quieted down. The storm had passed, leaving behind a scow that no longer frightened me. The Reed Foundation began as an idea, scribbled in the margins of my book, a simple notion that pain, when guided gently, could become art. Within a year, it became a real place, a converted mill on the outskirts of Burlington, its windows tall and its rooms full of light. We offered classes for people who'd forgotten how to begin again, widowers, divorcees, veterans, anyone who'd lost something they couldn't name. They came to learn painting, writing, sculpting. Most came to remember themselves. Some mornings, I'd walk the halls and hear the soft scratch of brushes or the sound of someone laughing again, for the first time in years. Every echo in that building reminded me that creation is the opposite of a despair. Ellen was there from the start. She became the Foundation's legal counsel mentor and quiet anchor. We never spoke about love, not the way movies expect you to. But she was there, steady and unspoken, in the way she poured coffee beside me, before the workshops, in the way she listened to the students' stories without judgment. There's a kind of companionship that doesn't need vows, just mutual survival. That was us. In the spring of the second year, we opened our first exhibition, The Waltz of the Faithful. The theme was endurance, the art of standing still in the ruins until beauty found its way back. On the central wall, surrounded by student paintings, I placed a single photograph, the mirrored wall, from the night of the gallery's downfall. The projection was gone, but the glass still held faint scratches of light, a ghost image of the truth that had once danced there. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Truth is the last dance we owe to ourselves." When I stepped back to look, it didn't feel like revenge anymore. It felt like release. The opening was quite intimate. No press, no headlines, just former students, a few friends and locals who came to see what healing looked like when it was painted instead of spoken. And then, near the end of the evening, I saw her. Laura. She stood in the doorway, smaller somehow, her hair streaked with gray, her posture cautious, but graceful, like someone who still remembered the choreography of dignity. She didn't wear makeup. She didn't need to. Time had done what humiliation couldn't. It made her human again. For a moment, our eyes met. I thought she might turn and leave. Instead, she walked slowly toward the central wall. No one else noticed her. The crowd moved around her as if she were invisible. Maybe she preferred it that way. She stopped before the photograph. Her fingers brushed the edge of the frame. When she read the plaque, I saw her lips move, whispering the words. Her shoulders trembled. A tear slipped down her cheek, small, unperformed, real. She stood there for another minute, then quietly turned, heading for the exit. I didn't stop her. Some goodbyes are meant to happen without sound. When the door closed behind her, the room seemed a little lighter. I walked to the window and watched her cross the street, her figure shrinking into the evening light. Ellen came up beside me. "Old ghosts?" she asked gently. I nodded. "Just leaving the building." She smiled and rested a hand on my arm, brief, respectful, steady. I watched until Laura disappeared around the corner, then whispered, barely loud enough for myself to hear, "Goodbye, Laura." The words didn't hurt. They just floated out, soft and final, like dust leaving a sunbeam. The guests lingered, laughter rising again among the paintings. The smell of paint and coffee filled the hall. Somewhere in the distance, a violinist, one of our students, began playing a waltz. It wasn't the same melody from the anniversary night, but it carried the same rhythm of closure, a dance no longer about love or loss, but balance. And yet, as I stood there, surrounded by light and forgiveness, I felt it, that subtle pull in the air, that quiet sense that one more thing remained unsaid. A truth not yet written. a page still blank. I began the letter on a quiet morning, the kind where the lake outside my window looked like glass, and the world had finally stopped demanding answers from me. Emily, if you're reading this, it means I've finally found the right silence to speak from. I paused, letting the ink settle. For years I had written blueprints for houses, galleries, even memorials, but never for hearts. This letter was my last design. Don't hate your mother, sweetheart. Hate is just love that refuses to leave the room. It keeps the wound open, polished, breathing. But it's not strength. It's the chain you forge yourself. She hurt me, yes. But before she did, she gave me you. And that's something sacred, no matter how much else fell apart. If one day you find yourself betrayed, and you will in some way, don't carry it like proof that you were foolish. Carry it like evidence that you were brave enough to love without a shield. The pen trembled in my hand. The words didn't feel like wisdom. They felt like truth extracted drop by drop. I once thought love was a promise, I wrote. But now I know it's a lesson, the kind that costs your heart to learn. I signed simply Dad. I placed the letter on the table beside my ring and a faded photo of Emily at 5, holding a seashell to her ear, as if she could hear the ocean inside it. Maybe love is like that, always a little out of reach, but still echoing somewhere. By noon, I packed a small bag and drove out of town. Ellen had insisted on taking care of the foundation, while I disappeared for a while. She called it retirement. I called it beginning again. The road curved along the edge of the lake, where the birch trees bent over the water, like they were whispering forgiveness to their reflections. I rolled down the window. The cold spring air stung my face, but felt clean, like starting over always should. When I reached the old dock, I parked and turned off the engine. The silence was enormous. Only the soft clicking of thawing ice broke it. I turned on the radio. Static, then music. A slow, haunting waltz spilled through the speakers. The last waltz. I laughed quietly. Life has a cruel sense of humor. Or maybe a gentle one. I stepped out of the car and stood by the water. The music followed me, soft and distant, carried by the breeze. I didn't plan to, but my feet began to move, one step, then another. Just like that night years ago, but this time there was no audience, no betrayal, no spotlight. Just me and the memory finally dancing for the right reasons. I let my hands rise, as if holding someone unseen, maybe the ghost of who I used to be. The dock creaked beneath me. The wind brushed against my shoulder like an old friend. For a moment I wasn't 57 or broken or betrayed. I was simply alive, imperfect, weightless, free. The song ended, fading into the sound of the lake breathing. And I smiled. Not because I'd forgotten, but because I'd finally learned how to remember without pain. I whispered into the open air, letting the words drift out over the water. Forgiveness isn't letting them back in. It's letting yourself go free. Then I got back in the car, started the engine, and drove toward the horizon. The road unfolded ahead like an unfinished sketch. Mine to draw, mine to live. And for the first time, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. When love breaks, we think the story's over. But sometimes it's only the house that collapses, not the soul that built it. I learned that forgiveness isn't an invitation to return. It's permission to walk away without hate. And if my story found you tonight, wherever you are, whoever you once loved, I hope you choose peace over pride and dignity over revenge. Because in the end, we all deserve one last waltz, even if we dance it a fine. Forgiveness isn't letting them back in. It's letting yourself go free. Tell me in the comments, would you have forgiven or walked away? Like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us it's never too late to rebuild your life.